Mexico is still paying tariffs. They're paying a 25% tariff on fentanyl, 25% tariff on cars, a 50% tariff on steel, aluminum, and copper. And additionally, Mexico has agreed to immediately terminate its non-tariff trade barriers, of which there are many. And as the president said, we will continue to talk to Mexico over the next 90 days with the goal of signing a larger trade deal.
No. You are not going to change your mind?
No, I'm not. Look, we've been ripped off for years, and we're not going to be ripped off anymore. No, I'm not going to bend at all. Aluminum or steel or cars, we're not going to bend. We've been ripped off as a country for many, many years. We've been subjected to costs that we shouldn't be subjected to.
Mexico President Claudia have closed the borders among USA and Mexico. Now U.S. residents have to apply for visa before entering Mexico, same as U.S. is demanding from Mexico. Mexico suspended the exports of copper to USA after closing confidential agreements with China. USA is already suffering for not having rare earth minerals.
No hay motivo, razón ni justificación que soporte esta decisión que afectará a nuestros pueblos y naciones. Lo hemos dicho de diferentes formas. Cooperación y coordinación, sí. Subordinación, intervencionismo, no. A México se le respeta. Quiero dejar claro el día de hoy que nosotros siempre buscaremos una solución negociada, como lo hemos propuesto, en el marco del respeto a nuestras soberanías. Pero la decisión unilateral que tome Estados Unidos afecta a las empresas nacionales y extranjeras que operan en nuestro país y afecta a nuestros pueblos.
The sudden disruption of exports from Mexico into the United States has sent shockwaves through economic and political circles, triggering disbelief, confusion, and escalating tension on both sides of the border. For decades, trade between Mexico and the United States functioned as one of the most deeply integrated economic relationships in the world. Supply chains stretched seamlessly across borders, factories operated on synchronized schedules, and entire industries were built on the assumption that goods would flow freely in both directions. That assumption has now been violently shaken. Reports of Mexico blocking or restricting key exports to the United States have ignited fears of a trade confrontation few anticipated. Unlike past disputes driven by tariffs or regulatory disagreements, this situation strikes at the physical movement of goods themselves. Trucks stalled at crossings, shipments delayed indefinitely, and contracts suddenly thrown into uncertainty have become symbols of a deeper rupture. For the United States, the shock lies not only in the economic impact but in the realization of how dependent critical sectors have become on uninterrupted Mexican exports. Manufacturing operations across the United States are among the first to feel the consequences. Automotive plants, electronics manufacturers, and appliance producers rely heavily on components produced in Mexico. These parts often arrive just in time, minimizing inventory costs and maximizing efficiency. When exports slow or stop, assembly lines grind to a halt within days. Workers are sent home, production targets are missed, and financial losses mount rapidly. What was once a model of efficiency now appears dangerously fragile. Agriculture and food supply chains are also under immediate strain. Mexico is a major supplier of fresh produce to the United States, particularly fruits and vegetables that cannot be easily sourced elsewhere year-round. Any interruption in exports threatens price spikes, shortages, and increased volatility for consumers. Grocery stores begin rationing certain items, restaurants adjust menus, and distributors scramble to find alternative suppliers at significantly higher cost. The impact is felt not only at the border but in households across the country. Energy and raw materials further complicate the picture. Cross-border trade in refined fuels, industrial inputs, and construction materials plays a crucial role in regional economies. When Mexico restricts exports, projects stall and costs escalate. Infrastructure development slows, housing prices face upward pressure, and investment confidence weakens. The interconnected nature of these markets means disruption in one area cascades rapidly into others, amplifying the economic shock. The disbelief surrounding the situation stems from how unexpected the move appears. Trade tensions between the United States and Mexico have flared before, but outright blocking of exports challenges long-standing norms. Businesses that invested billions based on stability now face losses that were never factored into risk assessments. Financial markets react nervously, with volatility reflecting uncertainty about how far the confrontation might escalate. Border communities are experiencing immediate fallout. Ports of entry that once buzzed with constant movement now see congestion and confusion. Truck drivers wait for hours or days without clarity, incurring costs they cannot easily absorb. Warehouses fill beyond capacity, while others sit empty due to lack of incoming goods. Local economies built around cross-border trade feel the strain as revenue drops and employment becomes uncertain. The broader concern within the United States is that this disruption signals a shift from negotiation to leverage. Blocking exports represents a powerful tool, one that directly targets economic dependency rather than abstract policy disputes. The fear is that once such measures are normalized, trade relationships become far more volatile. Trust erodes quickly when supply chains can be shut down without warning. Mexico, for its part, faces its own risks. Export-driven industries depend heavily on access to the United States market. Prolonged restrictions threaten domestic employment, investment, and economic growth. Yet the willingness to take such a step suggests that the calculus has changed, prioritizing strategic leverage over short-term stability. This shift alarms observers who worry that mutual economic damage may be escalating beyond control. Within the United States, the situation has sparked urgent discussions about resilience and dependence. Policymakers and industry leaders are confronting uncomfortable questions about how much of the national economy relies on external production. Calls to reshore manufacturing and diversify supply chains grow louder, yet such transformations cannot happen quickly. Years of optimization around cross-border efficiency cannot be undone. Overnight, without significant cost, consumers begin to feel the effects as prices rise and availability shrinks. Inflationary pressure increases as companies pass higher costs downstream. Public frustration grows, particularly as the reasons behind the disruption appear complex and opaque. The sense that everyday life is being affected by geopolitical maneuvering intensifies political pressure for swift resolution. What makes this trade conflict particularly unsettling is its unpredictability. Unlike formal trade wars marked by tariffs and negotiations, export blocking introduces a blunt and immediate instrument. It bypasses gradual escalation and delivers instant impact. Businesses accustomed to managing risk through diversification and contracts find themselves exposed to forces beyond their control as the situation unfolds. Uncertainty dominates planning at every level. Companies hesitate to commit to new investments, unsure whether supply lines will stabilize. Workers fear layoffs as production slows. Local governments worry about declining tax revenue tied to industrial activity. The shock reverberates through confidence as much as through commerce. The trade war no one saw coming is redefining assumptions about economic partnership between Mexico and the United States. It exposes the vulnerability created by deep integration without sufficient safeguards. Whether this confrontation leads to negotiation, escalation, or long-term restructuring remains unclear. What is certain is that disbelief has given way to a sobering realization. Even the most established trade relationships can fracture abruptly, leaving economies scrambling to adapt in a world where leverage increasingly outweighs predictability. The unfolding disruption caused by Mexico blocking or restricting exports to the United States is no longer viewed as a temporary shock but as a turning point with far-reaching implications. What initially sparked disbelief has evolved into a deeper sense of alarm as businesses, policymakers, and consumers begin to understand the scale of exposure created by decades of tightly integrated trade. The longer the restrictions persist, the clearer it becomes that this confrontation reaches far beyond a single dispute and instead challenges the foundation of North American economic cooperation. Supply chains within the United States are now showing visible signs of strain. Manufacturers that relied on predictable cross-border delivery schedules are being forced to idle production lines or operate at reduced capacity. Unlike past trade disputes where tariffs increased costs gradually, the physical blocking of exports creates immediate shortages. Inventories designed for efficiency rather than resilience are depleted quickly, leaving little buffer against prolonged disruption. This has exposed a structural weakness in how modern industry manages risk. Small and mid-sized businesses are particularly vulnerable. Larger corporations may have the financial reserves or alternative suppliers needed to absorb short-term disruption. But smaller firms often operate with limited capital and narrow margins. When critical inputs from Mexico fail to arrive, these businesses face stark choices: suspend operations, incur debt to source more expensive alternatives, or close altogether. Across the United States, this pressure is translating into layoffs, reduced hours, and delayed wages, intensifying economic anxiety at the local level. The agricultural sector continues to feel compounding effects. Fresh produce shortages are becoming more pronounced as export restrictions disrupt established supply routes. Seasonal crops that once flowed seamlessly from Mexico into the United States are now delayed or unavailable, leading to price spikes and uneven availability. Farmers within the United States struggle to fill the gap, constrained by climate, labor availability, and production timelines. The result is heightened volatility that affects distributors, retailers, and consumers alike. Transportation and logistics networks are under severe stress. Trucking companies face mounting costs as vehicles remain idle at border crossings or are rerouted inefficiently. Fuel expenses rise, delivery schedules collapse, and contractual penalties accumulate. Rail and port operations are also affected as cargo volumes fluctuate unpredictably. These disruptions weaken the reliability of the broader transportation system, creating knock-on effects for industries far removed from the original trade conflict. Energy and construction sectors are experiencing delayed projects and escalating costs. Materials sourced from Mexico play a crucial role in infrastructure development. Across the United States, when exports are blocked, timelines extend and budgets overrun. Contractors struggle to honor agreements and public projects face postponement. These delays not only increase expenses but also slow economic activity, reducing employment and weakening regional growth prospects. Financial markets reflect growing unease. Investors are reassessing risk assumptions tied to cross-border trade, and volatility increases as uncertainty persists. Companies with heavy exposure to Mexican supply chains see declining valuations, while lenders tighten credit conditions. This cautious environment discourages investment, further slowing economic momentum. Confidence, once anchored in the stability of regional trade agreements, is eroding under the weight of unpredictability. The political response within the United States has intensified as the economic costs become harder to dismiss. Calls for diversification of supply chains grow louder, emphasizing the need to reduce dependence on any single trading partner. However, reshoring or relocating production requires time, capital, and skilled labor, all of which are constrained. The gap between strategic ambition and practical execution becomes increasingly apparent, fueling frustration and debate. Mexico also faces mounting internal pressures. Export-driven industries confront declining revenue and rising unemployment as access to the United States market narrows. Domestic supply gluts form as goods intended for export remain unsold or undervalued. While the export restrictions may provide leverage in the short term, the long-term economic cost threatens stability. This tension underscores the mutual vulnerability inherent in deeply intertwined economies. Consumers in the United States are beginning to adjust behavior in response to rising prices and limited availability. Substitution becomes common as certain products disappear or become unaffordable. This shift alters demand patterns, creating winners and losers across sectors. However, substitution often comes at the expense of quality or choice, reinforcing public frustration and amplifying political pressure to resolve the conflict. The trade disruption has also reignited discussions about national resilience. Dependence on external production is no longer viewed solely as an efficiency strategy but as a potential liability. Policymakers and industry leaders debate the balance between cost savings and security, questioning whether decades of optimization have left the economy exposed. The realization that a single policy decision can stall entire industries is reshaping strategic thinking. Border regions continue to bear disproportionate hardship. Communities built around cross-border commerce see revenue evaporate as traffic slows and businesses close. Employment opportunities shrink and local governments struggle to maintain services amid declining tax bases. These areas, once symbols of integration and cooperation, now represent the human cost of disrupted trade relationships. The psychological dimension of the conflict is increasingly evident. Uncertainty erodes trust, making long-term planning difficult. Businesses hesitate to invest, workers fear instability, and consumers brace for further disruption. This collective anxiety feeds a negative feedback loop, suppressing economic activity even in sectors not directly affected by export restrictions. What distinguishes this trade conflict from previous disputes is its unpredictability. Export blocking bypasses gradual escalation and delivers immediate consequences. It undermines the assumption that trade disagreements will follow predictable diplomatic channels. This shift alters how risk is perceived and managed. not only between Mexico and the United States but in global trade more broadly. As the standoff persists, the possibility of lasting change grows. Supply chains may permanently reconfigure, investment flows may shift, and trade relationships may become more cautious and transactional. The economic integration that once defined North American trade could give way to a more fragmented and defensive model. Such a transformation would carry significant costs but may be viewed as necessary to restore a sense of control. The disbelief that initially greeted reports of blocked exports has faded, replaced by a sobering awareness of vulnerability. The trade war no one saw coming has exposed how deeply interconnected economies can become without adequate safeguards. Whether this moment leads to renewed cooperation or entrenched division will depend on choices made in the months ahead. What remains certain is that the disruption has already reshaped assumptions about stability, leverage, and trust between Mexico and the United States, leaving a lasting imprint on how trade is understood and managed in an increasingly uncertain world.